My name is Bhupesh Agrawal, and I'm Director of Product Marketing for Private Networks and Edge Computing. Today, we are going to talk about private networks use cases beyond industrial. As what we have seen in 2018, 2019, private network was always related to the industrial verticals. But as we moved into 2020 and 2021, we are seeing that there are use cases that the industry is adopting beyond just the industrial vertical. And we will talk about some of those use cases today. In our agenda item today, we have 3 items. We will talk about what is a private network, what are the different use cases across the IoT business verticals, and I'm also going to touch about some of the examples where we are putting private network beyond the industrial use case. So what is a private network? Private network, traditionally, the cellular technology has been managed or controlled by the carriers in providing the public network. This is a dedicated licensed spectrum provided by the government authorities to the carriers, and it is meant for the broader coverage. In the private network space, there are 2 ways. One is a slice of the spectrum that these carriers own, or there is another way where the government's authorities are opening the spectrum for the private usages. And this is adopted by more and more industry IoT verticals because of 3 reasons: coverage, capacity, and control of data and applications in the context of edge computing. We will talk about this in the following slide. As I talk about, more and more governments across the world are opening up spectrum for the private usages. As you can see here, right, not only in the North America, but in Asia and Europe, right, you have a different mechanisms for the private spectrum. In Germany, it's more, if you want to access the private spectrum, you have to control the regulators. In China, you have to go through the service providers, and in the US, you have a mechanism where you go through one of those 5 SaaS players assigned by the FCC to control the CBRS spectrum. So in the context of US, what is the CBRS spectrum that everyone keeps talking about? It's 150 megahertz of spectrum that the FCC has put aside for the private usages. It has 3 layers. One is the incumbent, which is the Department of Defense, Navy in particular. The second one is the PAL, Priority Access License Holder. These are the entities who have purchased the license of this spectrum from FCC last year. And these are some of the private entities, as well as some of the carriers, the big carriers who have done it for various reasons. I'm going to talk about those primary use cases or the motives to why these entities have gone for these private spectrum. And the third one is the GA. These are for the general authorized access users. These are the ones who have not purchased the this spectrum from the FCC, but they can still take advantage of the spectrum for their own purposes. It could be for education, it could be for ports, or it could be for industrials. And we'll talk about some of those use cases in the next slide. Before I go into the use cases, I want to talk about the 3 layers of private networks. And this is important to understand as we look at the overall motive of private networks in the space of IoT verticals. There are 3 layers of private networks. One is the network infrastructure layer. This consists of the radio access network, edge computing, and the cloud. The second one is a virtual network function. This is about SD-WAN and firewalls, an integral part of any enterprise environment. And the third one, equally important, the IoT data sources and IoT application services. Please note that the need for private networks emerge because of the IoT use cases that are not being able to solve by the wired line infrastructure or the Wi-Fi infrastructure. A network infrastructure in this case is a mean to solve the problem. So let's talk about the use cases. There are 3 broad categories of use cases. One is the enterprise on-premise, and this is where you see like industrial vertical or the retail or mining and ports, where where these enterprises are getting the data from the IoT data sources. They have challenges with the wireline infrastructure in terms of the cost, in terms of mobility, or they have challenges in terms in terms of the Wi-Fi infrastructure when you talk about the reliability, bandwidth, right, and dead spots and all. With the with the private network infrastructure added with the edge computing thing, they can have much better coverage, much better capacity, and they can have much better control over the data and application. The second use case, the broader category of use case, is the fixed wireless access and mobility offload. To give you some example, this is where if you think about the rural area or the education area, this is where the the tier 2 service providers are providing services using private network or CBR spectrum to provide the broadband to the rural areas or even to the school students, which cannot, these students who cannot access Wi-Fi network outside the school or the college building. The yeah, and an offshoot of that one is a mobility offload, right? Which is where MVNOs currently who are relying on the big carriers, they are also using private network to do the mobility offload, so that they can save on the cost that they typically pay to the big carriers or the big service providers. With the help of the private networks, we are seeing more and more MVNOs are putting private network in a busier places like Times Square and all, so that their customers can connect to the local private network versus sending the traffic to the big carriers or the service provider infrastructure. And the third one is a neutral host solution. This is, think about like in a buildings or smart buildings or the stadiums and all. There are primarily two type of use cases that we are seeing in the neutral host solution. One is in the case of like buildings and all, where you have these smart sensors and all, connecting these sensors to the private network with a better reliability and all is providing much better information to the smart building owners. But the second one is for the residents, and these could be either the residents who are living in the apartment in these buildings, or or the other one could be the workers who could be who could be working there in the buildings and all. The challenge that we are seeing in the market space is that the roaming facility for these workers or the residents. So if you are a resident or a worker who is talking outside the building over your regular carrier network, and as you are entering into the building, you may want to have a seamless connection on your private network. But for that, the private network service provider who is providing the private network within the building has to have some kind of business relationship with the big service provider in terms of integrating the packet core. And that's where this is what we are seeing is there are lots of white paper in the industry, but the actual implementation is not happening because there is not much incentive for these big carriers or the service providers to really go and expose their packet core to these small private network players who are deploying the network. The mathematics does not work there. If you're talking about a building of say 1,000 residents or 1,000 workers, you divide it by three, like three service providers, you're talking about only 300 subscriber from the service provider. For 300 service subscriber, the service provider won't be incentivized to really get into a business relationship with a private network player who is deploying the private network. So again, for the IoT data sources in the smart building, absolutely yes, that's happening in the industry. For the seamless connectivity for the roaming, whether it's happening, it's that there are lots of talks happening, there are lots of white paper, but the actual implementations are still lacking in the industry. And this is one of the area where industry is really looking how to solve the problem. So as I mentioned, right, those three broader category of use cases, it's enterprise on-prem, fixed wireless access, and the mobility offload. And the third one, the neutral host solution. These are driving different use cases across IoT verticals, not only the industrial, but also smart office, smart hotel, smart cities, right? Smart campuses, smart healthcare. These are all emerging. There are a lot of investment that is being done by the ecosystem players in these deployments. And there are some new learnings that are coming up, which we'll talk about in the following slides. So as I mentioned, right, in 2018, 2019, when everyone was talking about private networks, the focus was on the industrial side. And probably it's because of the reason where it was primarily driven by Germany. So it's more industrial focus. But as we saw in 2020 and now in 2021, private network is not just limited to industrial. We are seeing in the case of education, we are seeing in the case of ports and transportation, we are seeing deployments in the case of smart agriculture, where it's changing the complete perspective from if instead of taking these plants and trees as plants and trees, if you start thinking about them as a IoT data sources, then you're talking about the humongous amount of data that you're getting, you're analyzing at the edge, and then you're using it for your advantage, right, for better yields. Similarly, like new home construction companies, they are, instead of putting the fiber, they are using private network to provide the fixed wireless access use case that I talked about in my previous slide, and provide the broadband to the new home. So that's a completely new, which was not thought which was not thought about in the past. That's a new use case that is coming. And I touch upon the smart stadiums and even the mining ones where you need security and surveillance application. There's a lack of connectivity, the backhaul connectivity. So you want to analyze the data on at the edge, and then you push the data into the cloud through the satellite link for cold and warm storage. So there are many use cases, and the list is growing beyond just the industrial. Now, in this section, we'll talk about the very specific examples on what we are doing, right? I will touch upon two examples. One is education and another one is the port one. We recently announced a partnership with a company called Keychain, as well as Utah Inland Port. And this is, we are working with the Utah Inland Port and Keychain to deploy private network in a 16,000 acre port in Utah. And one of the main use cases is about the trackability as well as the data analysis for the cargo and the transportation thing. What you see here is a typical truck or the trailer that we see on the roads. But what we do not realize is there are multiple facets of the data out here. One is the truck number. Second one is the chassis and the chassis registration number. The third one is the container number. Fourth one is the loading status. And the fifth one is the emission level. Not many people know that these trucks waste 40% of their time at the ports, right? Just standing there or going through the manual process, right? Waiting in the line, getting checked for these things. And there is a manual process where there are 2 or 3 people who are writing these numbers, then inserting them putting them in the computer and then sending it. And when these things happen, everything is happening manually, then you can imagine how many errors that can happen. Not only that, the sharing of the data is a big challenge here, because the ownership of the truck, ownership of the chassis, ownership of the container, these are managed by different players. And in some cases, they do not have a visibility on whose container my truck is taking or whose chassis my truck is taking and all. So the sharing of that information is not happening right now, or it's happening through a manual process. So what we are working with the keychain and Utah Inland Port, just as part of the phase one, we want to deploy private networks, and we are trying to control the cargo movement automatically with the help of private network. Why private network? Because when you look at these ports, or what you see here is that the service providers, because there are no subscribers there, there is no incentive for the service providers to put an infrastructure there. So this is where, when you don't have the infrastructure there, you don't have the connectivity. When you don't have the connectivity, then it's very difficult to automate the whole process. With the help of private network, now we can put the connectivity in place. We can also take the advantage of the edge compute, right? Where the edge computing, even the cameras fitted with the edge compute module, they can collect the information of the truck, chassis, container and all, and can automatically control the gates, as well as send the information into the cloud, where it can be shared with across multiple players. So this is what we are doing we are planning to do at Utah Inland Port, but this is what we did a pilot in the near the port of LA or the Long Beach last year in partnership with Keychain. The second one is education. We recently, in Q2 this year, we recently announced our partnership with AWS and a company called Mac Computing. We have recently deployed CBRS private network in a Sacramento school district, where there are three areas that we are trying to cover. One is the school parking lot. As I mentioned, that in the education space, students can have access to the Wi-Fi within the building, but it's very difficult for them to get the connectivity within the school parking lot, or especially in the case of COVID, where the schools were closed. The second area that we are trying to cover is the nearby homes for the low-income housing groups, where the last mile connectivity is a big problem. Service providers are not incentivized to put the fiber because it's costly and there is not enough ROI. But with the help of the private network, we understand that there is a one common infrastructure that can provide broadband to these families. And the third one is the community center, which is close to these homes. So three areas: the school parking lot, the homes for those low-income housing families, and the community center, which community center is more willing to put a private network for the security and surveillance applications or telehealth kind of use cases and all. We are partnering with AWS there, which is bringing the Snowball Edge device with Ethernet packet core, and the applications are going to run in the cloud. And the Mac Computing is bringing the security and surveillance application, all running on IA. So these are some of the use cases beyond just the industrial, which we are seeing tremendous traction in 2020 and 2021, thinking beyond like industrial retail kind of use cases and getting into the areas which was previously not thinkable. This is what I talk about, right? Those three areas, like as you can see on the right, like you have the parking lot, the school parking lot, the elementary school parking lot. You have the homes near to the school, and this is the community center. It covers almost 3/4 of the mile area. Our plan is to cover 1,200 users, and by end of this year through this pilot. So I hope getting an overview around the private use case, private network use cases beyond just the industrial, has given enough clarity around that the private network is not only for one vertical, but it's getting a lot of traction among several other IoT verticals. So thank you for your time. And now we can open up for some Q&As.
Yeah, Bhupesh, I have a question on that education K-12 scenario. What client devices are being used in the homes or in the parking lot to access the internet? If or are you using CBRS as just your backhaul and then converting it back to Wi-Fi for the local access?
So there are, in this particular one, we are using Chromebooks with a multi-tech dongle because as we discussed, right, like the biggest challenge is that the Chromebooks do not come with support for band 48 right now, which is a CBRS band, right? So you need to have a dongle that connects to the CBRS network. That's one use case. Which is what is implemented here. The second type of use cases that we are seeing in education space is what you're talking about, where the CBRS is used as a backhaul. So think about where you have a school bus where you have an adapter, right, Wi-Fi adapter, which is providing the coverage to the students who are in the bus. But then that adapter is connected to the CBRS network, and CBRS network is providing the backhaul connectivity.
So to follow on with that, in your example in the port and all the scanners, were all the scanners that you're using also using a local SIM and CBRS for their internet connectivity?
That is correct, right? That's a plan, right? What we did as a POC last year at the near the port of LA or Long Beach was based on that. Like we have the cameras, we have the local edge compute device, and then we also have the SIM that is connecting to the private network.
Well, if I can dovetail into this is Sam Clements, by the way. If I can dovetail into that, I had a question about the vehicle use case, in where you're reading multiple aspects of a vehicle. Are you reading those with sensors that are CBRS, or private LTE sensors, or are you aggregating that to one sort of radio head end in the cab using Zigbee to talk to these other sensors or something else like that? Is it a straight greenfield CBRS front to back, top to bottom solution, or are you using other technologies on vehicle for the local connectivity?
It's the cameras which are connected to the CBRS network. So these multiple cameras are detecting those values, right? Whether the container number or the chassis number or the truck number, they are capturing that and putting it into the application that the keychain is building, and then pumping the data into the cloud, right, with the CBRS network. So it's one network versus the multiple technologies.
Hey, this is Avril Sorter. I have a question regarding staffing. I mean, we've all seen schools, probably poor areas, don't have the luxury of a really strong IT team. When we're looking at deploying these private networks, what's Intel's advice to people? Is it always going to be a system integrator? Is it a fairly low learning curve for a Wi-Fi person to then move into cellular? What's your perspective from enterprises getting staffed up to be able to deploy and support private cellular networks?
So in the context of education or the schools and all, we still recommend that the school districts who are planning to deploy private network, or even the colleges who are planning to deploy private network, should go with the managed service providers. And the reasons are following. One is that deployment is one thing, but then managing it is a different thing. And not many IT player, like IT teams within the school districts, right, or the education space, are well versed in the cellular technologies. The second one is also about the security of the data and application, right? When you are talking about the edge computing thing, that means you also have the information about the students, what students are doing, what applications that they are accessing, what other things that they are doing on these devices. There is a big risk that if you do not have the right security mechanism, and if something gets leaked out or there is some kind of like attack and all, then it can also create some privacy and security concerns. That's where having some professional team from the managed service provider is the right one. Now, the flip side is that it increases the cost of the overall solution, because the cost is divided in CapEx, initial deployment, like the construction and all, and the managed service provider. So it adds on the managed service provider or the managed services side of the cost, which can be humongous, right, because of the L2 and L3 support. But again, uh, this is where the school districts or the colleges, they have to do the analysis on the benefits.
Okay, thank you.
This is Drew Lentz. To go into that question, what I've seen work in some of my deployments has been where you have a combination of the two, feeding Wi-Fi into areas so that the management of those devices and the client devices is very low, and then having CBRS to backhaul that data or to move that data, for last mile connectivity. And so my question is with all these heterogeneous networks, right? Zigbee, LoRaWAN, Wi-Fi, CBRS, LTE, low Earth orbiting satellites, everything that's out there, where from a management perspective in the future, the Telecom Infra project has talked about the Unity platform and about, kind of one device to rule them all, right? One device from a management perspective. Is Intel doing anything to help along those lines so that from a network administrator's perspective, we're not managing 15 different types of RF, we're just managing one type of one connectivity source where people can get connected?
Yeah, we are working with lots of industry players, right? And this one, because we also want to simplify. The growth of these kind of things will not happen unless we resolve these technological challenges, right? Especially as you talk about the heterogeneous environment and all, right? Like even like for the private network, right? Like if we are talking about these devices, and we know that there are challenges around devices supporting band 48, whereas you look at these Wi-Fi ecosystem is pretty robust now, right? And then you add on to these Zigbees and all. So absolutely, yes, we are working with the industry leaders, right? In fact, there are new SIGs or the specification industry groups that we are partnering with to help resolve some of these challenges and simplify it so that the industry can adopt more and more of these in a very simplified manner.
Great, thank you.
When I talk to organizations, enterprises in particular, about CBRS, they tend to be very excited until they arrive at a point where they realize that if they have to pick up their facilities and relocate them to somewhere that they don't know yet today, that new location may have no CBRS spectrum available to them. The GA allocation might be completely exhausted, because we don't get spectral reuse with any sort of reasonable sort of dimensions, especially in like high-rise buildings, downtowns, and things along those lines. What advice would you give an organization who's looking to adopt a CBRS solution, knowing that there's a good chance if they have to relocate their headquarters or open up a new facility or do something else, that solution might not work?
That is true, right? And to be very honest, this is kind of like one of those challenges that we are seeing in the industry. And it's not only locally, right? Like an enterprise or a company can move its headquarters to within the same country, right? And as you mentioned, right, they may not have the GA spectrum. And even if they move outside the country to a different location where you have the private spectrum in a completely different band. So those are definitely a challenge. I think this is where these businesses have to really look into the long-term standpoint on what their strategies are, right? In terms of are they expecting any move, or are they expecting to remain stable in one location and all? So
I can tell you one thing that most enterprises don't do is have their facilities people consult their IT people prior to relocating.
that is true. Yeah, that is
So
true.
that is a huge problem, and you're right, they should, but the reality is 99.9% of enterprises, at least in the States, there is a complete and total disconnect between facilities and relocation and IT support.
Absolutely. And you brought up a good point, because when we look at the IT, the way we look at it is more about the indoor or the indoor infrastructure piece, right? Whereas now with the private network and all, we also not only have to look at the indoor infrastructure, but we also have to see what kind of support we are getting from the external infrastructure, which is like the spectrum and all, which is different than you're deploying a Wi-Fi within an indoor facility. So certainly a challenge.
Yeah, this is Keith Parsons again. With this question is about a little broader subject. People talk about Wi-Fi 6, 5G, CBRS, a bunch of these, and what I've heard over and over is it's versus 5G versus Wi-Fi, CBRS, private networks versus public networks. Can you talk a little bit about how these are, what makes them competitors and what makes them get along together?
Yeah, so you're right that there is a lot of discussion and comparison between Wi-Fi 6 and private network, especially when we're talking about the technology like OFDM, right? Or there are discussions around the reliability that Wi-Fi 6 provides the same kind of reliability, right? Like the cellular technologies and all. There are also discussions around the cost. So again, it's a different school of thought. Like I would say, like the two parallel uh, uh, set of people, right, talking about Wi-Fi 6 and the benefit, and they are the ones, right, who have invested a lot of time and energy in Wi-Fi 6, all for good reasons. And then there are others who are talking about the private network and see it as a good solution, right? I won't say that completely replacing the Wi-Fi thing at all. What we are seeing is based on our experience working with the different enterprises and the venue owners, that these things are going to coexist. Some of the things that we talk about, the segregation of the workload, the IT versus OT, where OT is going to stay on Wi-Fi and the mission critical IT workloads will stay on private network, but also the ecosystem of the devices and the connectivity, right? Like you have a very strong ecosystem of devices, which will in Wi-Fi, where you bring a device, you have the user ID and password, you connect to the Wi-Fi network. Whereas in the private network, because it's based on the cellular technology, you need to assign a SIM to an individual owner. So if you're talking about hundreds and thousands of say like fans and visitors in the stadium and all, you're not going to provide the SIM, right, to each of them to connect to your private network. That's where the value of Wi-Fi really comes into picture. Now, in the case of enterprise environment, like the industrials and all, right, where do we see private network or do we see Wi-Fi? It depends on what the challenge that the challenge that the enterprise is facing. If it is facing a lot of challenges with respect to the dead spots, right, or the bandwidth or the latency from the current Wi-Fi infrastructure, they may choose to go with a private network, else they will continue with the Wi-Fi network and they upgrade it to Wi-Fi 6.
Which group do you think is going to be the owners of private networks moving forward? So far, the public networks are owned by the telcos, the cell providers. You have to go to them to do the work. Wi-Fi is done internally with your own IT staff. Where do you see the private networks falling as far as who's going to be the internal owner within a company?
It's going to be very heterogeneous, I would say, setup that we see it, right? Because you mentioned about the teams managing the Wi-Fi, right? You also talk about the carriers who are managing the public networks, and these carriers have already an existing relationship with the enterprises, so they might come and they may provide the managed services for the private network. At the same time, think about the data and application, right? These enterprises have very close relationship with the cloud service providers. So the cloud service providers who are willing to uh, get into the private network business because they control the edge compute, they control the cloud applications and all. So we have done a survey with the enterprises, and in a survey, the enterprises reflected that they want to work with the cloud service providers for private network. So you see there are lots of lots of players. And then on top of that, you have the new players who are coming, who can probably provide at a much lower cost, because these are some of the new startup companies and all providing the integrated solution. So there are lots of players who are going to provide the private network for the enterprises. It depends on the private network's business decision on whether they want to go with a cloud service provider because, hey, I'm already a customer of this cloud service provider. How would I bring them so that they have the end-to-end control of the data? Or they go with a comm service provider or carrier, or they might assign this responsibility to their existing IT teams, right? Who is managing the Wi-Fi network.
This is Avril jumping in with another question for you around use cases. So the FCC is opening up more spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band, but it's also doing some stuff in the 12 gig and also in the millimeter wave for private networks, enterprise networks as well. And of course, there you're talking about very small cells, your coverage issues changes completely. Is Intel got any work going on there? Anything you can share with us, any use cases that point to those higher frequency bands and how they might be used in the enterprise?
Yeah, we are working very closely. We have our federal team who works very closely with FCC as well as industrial players who are industry leaders who are looking into this space. But as you can imagine, the private network space, right, whether we are talking about the 3.5 gigahertz kind of thing, or the millimeter wave that you talk about, it's pretty new market right now, right? And what we are seeing, this 3.5 is the one that has started taking off a little bit. I think it will go for some time because of the cost reasons. And within that, right, you can talk about whether it's a private LTE versus 5G. Most of the deployments that are happening right now are on a private LTE because of the cost reasons, because the LTE devices, right, are much cheaper than the 5G, and the 5G ecosystem is not there yet, right? Like the different companies or the partners are still working on their 5G supported Mac device or the packet core or the radios and all. So we would see we will see, I think this whole growth in the 3.5 gigahertz will continue for some years. And at the same time, we'll see if this millimeter wave for some very specific use cases, whether some of those players, right, they'll start deploying it. But we are not seeing much of a deployment there in the millimeter space in the context of private networks yet.
Okay, thank you.
I hope it was a good session for you, where you learned about the use cases that private network is not just about industrials. There are many more industry verticals that are adopting private network, especially the CBRS in the US. And I really enjoy the Q&A session. So thanks a lot for your time. We'll talk more.